parallels. These equations are the very foundation of understanding, which clearly is beyond your grasp.
Black schoolgirl said she'd solve what professor debated for decades, thought it was a joke until. Professor Jason White, an acclaimed mathematician in an immaculate charcoal suit, stands at the symposium registration desk holding up a form like evidence in a trial. His voice cuts through Cambridge Hall, Victoria Brown. Age 12. Thornwood Middle School. He enunciates each word with surgical precision, letting the room absorb the absurdity. The crowd of doctoral candidates and tenured professors erupts in knowing laughter. The contrast between White's designer wire-rimmed glasses and the young black girl's worn notebook, edges frayed, pages bulging with handwritten equations, immediately establishes a battle between institutional gatekeeping and raw, unrecognized brilliance. Security, White announces, his smile cold and performative, please escort this child back to whatever science fair she wandered away from. After the initial confrontation where the crowd films Victoria's humiliation on their phones, the girl who dared claim she could solve the White-Tanaka conjecture, a problem that has fractured the mathematics world for 28 years, the story flashes back 6 months to Johns Hopkins University at 11 p.m. We see Victoria's hidden world, a small 12-year-old girl in oversized sweatpants, sitting cross-legged on the cold floor of an empty lecture hall, surrounded by discarded chalk and the ghost of equations still visible on blackboards. While her father, Marcus, mops the hallways in his custodian uniform, Victoria fills her notebooks with graduate-level proofs that would astound the professors who walk these halls by day. We are introduced to her reality, the night shift world of the invisible, her self-taught education scavenged from recycling bins and recorded lectures, and her devoted father who doesn't understand the symbols his daughter writes, but understands that she sees something in them worth chasing. 6 months before the humiliation at Cambridge Hall, Victoria Brown learned mathematics the way most kids learn to be invisible, through necessity and repetition. Every night at 10:47 p.m., Marcus Brown's key card beeped against the Hopkins Mathematics building entrance, and every night, Victoria slipped through behind him carrying a backpack that weighed more than it should. Building 3 tonight, baby girl, Marcus said, adjusting the cleaning cart that squeaked down the polished hallway. You got your homework? Victoria nodded, though they both knew she'd finished her 7th grade pre-algebra worksheet on the bus ride over. The homework that mattered was tucked inside her bag, a water-damaged copy of Introduction to Topology she'd fished from a recycling bin 3 weeks ago. Marcus disappeared into the first classroom with his mop and industrial cleaner, and Victoria climbed the stairs to Lecture Hall C. She'd memorized the building's rhythms, which rooms stayed empty longest, which professors left equations on their blackboards, which recycling bins held discarded problem sets that she could reverse engineer like archaeological artifacts. Tonight, the board still held remnants of a graduate seminar, partial differential equations cascading across the slate in 3 different colors of chalk. Victoria pulled out her notebook, the one with Victoria Brown, 7th grade, written on the front in her careful handwriting, and began copying the equations. Not to solve them, she'd already worked through differential equations last month, but because something about the way Professor Chen had arranged them suggested a pattern she wanted to explore. You understand any of that? Marcus appeared in the doorway an hour later, leaning on his mop. Some of it. Victoria's fingers were white with chalk dust. It's about how things change over time. Like, if you know where something is and how fast it's moving, you can predict where it'll go. Marcus smiled the way he always did when she explained mathematics, proud but distant, like watching someone speak a language he'd never learned. Your mama would have understood it, he said quietly. She had that same look you get. Like you're seeing something nobody else can see. Victoria glanced at her father's reflection in the dark window, 52 years old, custodian uniform sagging on his thin frame, hands raw from chemicals. Outside, Johns Hopkins University glittered with the kind of wealth that existed in a different universe from their Section 8 apartment in Thornwood. But here, in this stolen hour before midnight, surrounded by equations that didn't care about her address or her father's job or the holes in her sneakers, Victoria felt rich. Dad, she said. What if I could solve something nobody else could? Something really big. Marcus walked over and kissed the top of her head. Baby girl, you already do that every single night. The paper that changed everything was crumpled at the bottom of a recycling bin outside Professor Whitmore's office, coffee-stained and marked with angry red ink, abandoned, approach fundamentally flawed. Victoria smoothed it against the hallway wall, her heart accelerating as she recognized the title, Attempted Reconciliation of the White-Tanaka Conjecture via Dimensional Bridge Theory. The graduate student had given up, but Victoria saw immediately what they'd missed. The flaw wasn't in the approach, but in the assumption that White and Tanaka's theories were opposites. She'd first heard about the White-Tanaka conjecture 3 months ago, when Mr. Okonkwo, the night security guard, had caught her reading a topology textbook in the stairwell. "You know about the war?" he'd asked, his Nigerian accent thick with amusement. "The one happening right here in this building?" He'd explained it like a story. Professor Jason White and Dr. Yuki Tanaka, once collaborators on dimensional constraint theory, had published opposing proofs in 1997. White claimed that certain mathematical structures could only exist in dimensions 2 through 4. Tanaka argued they could exist in 5 or more dimensions, but required completely different axioms. The mathematics community had fractured. Careers were built choosing sides. Papers were rejected based on which theory they cited. Friendships dissolved over conference presentations. 28 years, Mr. Okonkwo had said, shaking his head. Two brilliant men, each convinced the other is wrong. But you know what I think? I think they're both looking at the same mountain from different sides, calling it different names. Now, holding the abandoned proof, Victoria understood. The graduate student had tried to prove one theory correct and the other wrong. But what if both were correct? What if the problem wasn't the mathematics, but the dimensional framework everyone was using to view it? She spent the next 2 weeks obsessed. While Marcus cleaned, Victoria filled notebooks with sketches, not equations yet, just shapes and arrows, trying to visualize how a mathematical structure could exist in 4 dimensions from one perspective and 5 from another. It was like that optical illusion where you see either a vase or 2 faces, depending on what you focused on. Not both/or. Both/and. The idea she called perspective geometry emerged at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, when she was supposed to be sleeping but couldn't stop thinking about dimensional constraints. If you observed a 3-dimensional object from a 2-dimensional plane, you'd only see its cross-section. You'd draw conclusions about its shape that would be true, but incomplete. What if White and Tanaka were both observing a 5-dimensional truth from 4-dimensional perspectives? She grabbed her notebook and started writing. At Thornwood Middle School, Victoria Brown was a ghost. She'd learned by 4th grade that smart girls got targeted, their notebooks stolen, their glasses broken, their lunch money taken as punishment for making other kids feel stupid. So she developed camouflage, finishing tests but never first, answering questions but never too many, letting her hand hover halfway up when teachers asked difficult questions, as if she wasn't quite sure. Victoria got a 94 on the pre-algebra test, Mrs. Chen announced one Thursday, and Victoria felt the weight of 26 sets of eyes. Excellent work. Not excellent enough to threaten anyone. Safe. But Mrs. Chen lingered after class, holding Victoria's test paper. You finished in 12 minutes, she said quietly. Then you sat there for 38 minutes pretending to check your work. Why? Victoria's throat tightened. I don't know what you. I've been teaching 22 years. I know when a student is hiding. Mrs. Chen pulled a college mathematics textbook from her bag. My daughter left this when she went to MIT. I think you might find it more interesting than our curriculum. The textbook was abstract algebra, theory and applications. Victoria carried it home like contraband. Her real education happened in the spaces nobody watched. At 3:15 a.m., when Marcus was finishing his shift and she was supposed to be asleep in the custodian's break room, Mr. Okonkwo would radio, "All clear," and Victoria would slip into whatever lecture hall had a recorded class playing on the projector. Hopkins recorded everything for online students, she just had to know which rooms had been left unsecured. "You're going to get me fired, small girl," Mr. Okonkwo whispered, but he always covered for her, always kept watch while she scribbled notes from graduate lectures she shouldn't understand but did. Some nights she'd find equations left on blackboards, problems the professors thought were challenging, problems she could solve in the margins of her notebook while Marcus's vacuum hummed down distant hallways. Once, she'd corrected an error in a proof left by Professor Whitmore, then erased her work before anyone could see it. The ghost in the mathematics building, learning in secret. It was Mr. Okonkwo who first mentioned the Cambridge Mathematics Symposium. "They're looking for unconventional thinkers," he said, showing her the announcement on his phone. "Anyone can register. Even 12-year-old girls who should be sleeping but are instead teaching themselves number theory." Victoria stared at the entry requirements: present an original mathematical perspective on a classical problem. She had one. The question was whether she was brave enough to stop being invisible. Mrs. Chen made the decision for her. "I'm entering you," she said the next day, sliding the registration form across her desk. "I already wrote the recommendation letter. You just need to sign." Victoria's hand trembled as she picked up the pen. Professor Jason White learned about Victoria Brown the way he learned about all threats to the natural order, through an email marked "urgent" from his graduate assistant. "Sir, you need to see this registration. A 12-year-old girl claims she can solve the White-Tanaka conjecture. Should I reject it automatically?" White stared at his computer screen in his corner office overlooking Hopkins' main quad, the same office he'd fought 11 years to earn. The walnut desk, the leather chair, the wall of published papers, each a brick in the fortress he'd built around himself and the mathematics he'd dedicated his life to protecting. He'd been that kid once. Not 12, 15, standing in a Nevada trailer park with a scholarship letter to Caltech, his mother crying because she couldn't afford the plane ticket. He'd clawed his way through undergraduate work on ramen and rage, through graduate school on loans and sleeping in his car, through postdoc positions where Ivy League legacies treated him like he'd stolen his seat at their table. And he had. That was the secret. He'd stolen what they'd inherited, taken what they'd assumed was theirs by birthright, and he'd proven he belonged through pure intellectual dominance. No shortcuts. No sympathy. No excuses. The White-Tanaka conjecture was his masterpiece, the proof that a working-class kid from nowhere could produce mathematics that changed the field. That his name would be spoken in the same breath as the giants. That he'd earned his place and nobody could take it from him. 28 years defending it. 28 years of refuting challenges, dismissing alternative approaches, maintaining the orthodoxy that he was correct and Tanaka was wrong. Not because he was certain, White had stopped being certain about anything around year 3, but because certainty was all he had. Doubt was a luxury for people with safety nets. Now this. A child. A middle schooler. From Thornwood, of all places, the kind of neighborhood White's colleagues locked their car doors driving through. He pulled up Victoria Brown's registration. The attached essay was titled "Both Sides of the Mountain, a Perspective-Based Approach to Dimensional Constraints." The writing was crude, the formatting inconsistent, but the core idea. White felt something cold settle in his chest. She'd seen it. Whatever it was, the angle he'd been deliberately not looking at for 2 decades because looking meant admitting he might have been wrong. This girl, this nobody from nowhere with her probably plagiarized essay and her absurd claim, had somehow stumbled onto the one approach that could unravel everything he'd built. He picked up his phone and called the symposium director. "Richard, about that 12-year-old registration." "Oh, we're definitely rejecting it. I just wanted to give you a heads up in case she makes a fuss." White paused. Said carefully, "Actually, let her register. Let her come." "Are you serious?" "Completely." White's smile was sharp. "If she wants to humiliate herself on a national stage, who are we to stop her?" The written qualifier took place in a Hopkins auditorium designed to hold 200 people. 73 candidates showed up, doctoral students, postdocs, 2 tenured professors hoping to finally crack the problem that had defined their field. And Victoria Brown, sitting in the back row in a blazer her father had bought from Goodwill, looking at the exam booklet like it might explode. 6 hours. 50 questions. Questions designed by White himself to eliminate anyone who hadn't spent a decade studying advanced mathematics. Victoria opened to the first page and felt her stomach drop. These weren't just difficult, they were deliberately obscure, testing knowledge of specific papers, specific proofs, specific academic lineages she'd never had access to. Question 12 referenced the standard application of Whitmore's third lemma, as discussed in Graduate Seminar 9b. She'd never been to Graduate Seminar 9b. She'd been in the hallway mopping floors while it happened. Around her, pens scratched confidently. A woman in the third row was already on page 5. Victoria forced herself to breathe. Looked at question 1 again, but differently, not as a test of what she'd been taught, but as a problem to solve. The question referenced Whitmore's third lemma, but the lemma was just a tool. What mattered was the underlying structure. She started writing, using her own framework, her own approach. If the graders didn't recognize it, they'd mark it wrong. But at least it would be her wrong answer. 3 hours later, Victoria set down her pencil. Around her, candidates were still frantically calculating, stress-sweating through their formal clothes. She'd answered every question, though half her solutions looked nothing like what they probably expected. She stood to leave, and 72 heads turned to stare. In the grading room that evening, Professor White sat with Dr. Yuki Tanaka and 3 other mathematicians, working through the exams. They'd already eliminated 40 candidates, blank pages, wrong approaches, fundamental misunderstandings. Number 47 is interesting, Tanaka said, her Japanese accent precise. She'd flown in specifically for the symposium, the first time she'd been in the same room as White in 19 years. Victoria Brown. She finished in 3 hours. Probably left it blank, White said without looking up. No. She answered everything. But her methods, Tanaka pushed the exam across the table. Jason, you need to see this. White scanned the first page, then the second, his expression darkening. Victoria had solved question 7, a problem about dimensional constraints, using a framework he'd never seen before. She called it perspective projection. She'd created a coordinate system that somehow. This is wrong, he said flatly. She's invented her own mathematics. That's not how this works. Is it wrong? Tanaka leaned forward. Or is it just different? Because when I check her answers against the solutions, they're correct. Every single one. White grabbed a red pen and began marking. Methodology not recognized. Approach unorthodox. Fails to cite standard proofs. He wrote 70 out of 100 at the top. That's still a passing score, another grader pointed out. Barely. White closed the exam. Lucky guessing. She won't make it past round 2. But that night, alone in his office, White pulled up Victoria's exam again and worked through problem 7 step by step, following her logic. And in the cold early morning hours, he realized 3 things. First, her proof was not just correct but elegant. Second, her framework could potentially be applied to other problems, including his conjecture. Third, he needed to destroy her before anyone else saw what he was seeing. Round 2 was a spectacle. The symposium organizers had decided to make it public, 10 problems projected on a giant screen, 2 minutes each, contestants solving on camera while an audience watched. Good for publicity. Good for showing off the next generation of mathematical minds. Victoria stood at Station 7, one of 15 candidates who'd survived the qualifier. To her left was a Harvard postdoc named Michael Chen. To her right, a Berkeley professor named Dr. Sarah Morrison. Both of them had looked at her badge, Victoria Brown, age 12, Thornwood Middle, and then looked away, dismissing her as a sympathy pass. The first problem appeared on screen, a differential equation that required integration by parts. Victoria's chalk was already moving before she'd consciously processed the question. Muscle memory from 1,000 midnight practice sessions in empty lecture halls. She finished in 47 seconds. 15 seconds later, her station light turned green, indicating a correct answer. She was the first. The audience murmured. Problem 2. Topology, finding the homeomorphism between two spaces. Victoria visualized it, saw the transformation, wrote the proof. Green light. First again. Problem 3, 4, 5. Each time, Victoria's light went green before anyone else's. By problem 6, the audience wasn't murmuring anymore, they were starting to react audibly. The cameras kept cutting to her station, to her rapid chalk work, to her expressionless face. Then came problem 8, and Victoria stopped. Stared at the screen. Read it again. The question was wrong. Not difficult, wrong. They'd asked for the proof of a theorem that had a false assumption built into its premise. Everyone else was solving it anyway, trying to force an answer. Victoria raised her hand. The moderator looked confused. Yes. The question is wrong. Victoria's voice carried through the microphone clipped to her blazer. You've assumed K is a compact subset, but that contradicts the condition you gave in Part A. The problem as written is unsolvable. The room went silent. On stage, Professor White stood from his observer's chair, his face reddening. Young lady, that question was written by. I know who wrote it, Victoria interrupted. But it's still wrong. Look at the setup again. The moderator pulled up the question on his tablet, reading carefully. His expression changed. He conferred with two other organizers, then turned to the audience. We're going to take a brief pause to review problem 8. The audience exploded, some clapping, some shouting objections. Michael Chen stared at Victoria like she'd grown a second head. Dr. Morrison was frantically rechecking her work. 12 minutes later, the moderator returned. Problem 8 has been invalidated due to an error in the premise. All contestants will receive full marks. We apologize for the confusion. Victoria's station light turned green, but so did everyone else's. That night, the video went viral. 12-year-old corrects math professor, exposes error in competition question. The comments section split between people calling her brilliant and people calling her arrogant, disrespectful, a show-off who didn't understand her place. Professor White watched the video 7 times, his jaw clenched. The problem had been his. The error had been his. And this child had exposed him in front of 500 people and however many thousands were watching online. He opened his laptop and began composing new questions for round 3. Questions specifically designed to exploit every weakness an informally educated 12-year-old would have. If Victoria Brown wanted to embarrass him, he'd return the favor. Round 3 took place in a wood-paneled conference room designed to intimidate, long table, leather chairs, 5 panelists sitting like a tribunal. Victoria sat alone at the opposite end, her notebook in front of her, Marcus watching from the gallery behind a velvet rope. Professor White sat center, flanked by 2 Hopkins mathematicians Victoria didn't recognize and Dr. Yuki Tanaka, who had flown in from Tokyo specifically for the finals. The 5th panelist was Dr. James Whitmore, Victoria's unknowing nighttime teacher. Ms. Brown, White began, adjusting his glasses with theatrical precision, this round requires you to defend your mathematical philosophy. To demonstrate not just that you can solve problems, but that you understand the foundations of mathematical thought. He smiled. Let's begin with a simple question, define a Hausdorff space using the standard topological axioms. Victoria did, reciting the definition she'd memorized from the water-damaged textbook. Good. Now, explain why Hausdorff's approach represents the correct formalization of topological separation, as opposed to, say, Kolmogorov's weaker axioms. The trap was obvious. White wasn't asking for mathematics, he was asking for academic lineage, for knowledge of which mathematician had, 1. Historical debates, for the kind of cultural understanding you only got from graduate seminars and conference gossip. I don't know if Hausdorff's approach is correct, Victoria said carefully. Both axiom systems are useful for different problems. It depends on what you're trying to prove. Spoken like someone who's never actually studied formal mathematics. White leaned back. Tell me, Ms. Brown, where exactly did you receive your training in topology? Online videos? YouTube? Marcus shifted in his seat, his hands clenched. I taught myself, Victoria said. From textbooks. Textbooks. White's voice dripped condescension. And tell me, in these textbooks, did you learn about the standard decomposition theorem? The one every first-year graduate student memorizes? Victoria hesitated. She'd seen references to something called a decomposition theorem, but standard, with a capital S, suggested a specific proof, a specific paper, a specific pedigree. I'm not familiar with. Of course you're not. White spread his hands to the other panelists. This is what happens when we lower our standards. When we let someone with no formal training, no proper education, no. Excuse me, Jason. Dr. Tanaka's voice cut through his monologue. She turned to Victoria, her expression neutral. Ms. Brown, I'd like to ask you about something different. In your qualifier exam, you used a framework you called perspective projection. Can you explain what that means? Victoria felt the shift in the room. Tanaka wasn't setting a trap, she was offering a lifeline. It's the idea that mathematical structures can exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, Victoria said, her voice growing stronger. And depending on which dimensional space you observe from, you see different properties. Not contradictory properties, complementary ones. Can you give an example? Victoria stood, walked to the whiteboard at the side of the room, and began drawing. A sphere, viewed from above, looks like a circle. Viewed from the side, also a circle. But those circles have different properties, different radii, different positions in space. Both observations are true. Neither is complete. What if the White-Tanaka conjecture is like this? Victoria drew faster now, her chalk clicking against the board. What if you're both observing a five-dimensional structure from four-dimensional perspectives? Professor White sees it from one angle and concludes it can only exist in dimensions 2 through 4. Dr. Tanaka sees it from another angle and concludes it needs 5 or more dimensions. But you're both right, you're just seeing different cross-sections of the same truth. The room had gone completely silent. White's face had turned the color of old paper. This is absurd. This is fascinating, Dr. Tanaka finished. She was leaning forward now, studying Victoria's drawings. Ms. Brown, have you formalized this framework? Written out the axioms? I'm working on it. I'd very much like to see that work. Tanaka glanced at White. In fact, I think Ms. Brown should proceed to the finals. Based on what? White demanded. Chalk drawings. Metaphors about spheres. Based on the fact that she sees something we've all been too proud to look at. Tanaka stood. I vote to advance. Dr. Whitmore was nodding slowly. I agree. Advance. The other two panelists looked at each other, then at White's furious expression, then at Victoria's drawings. Both raised their hands. Advance. White stood so abruptly his chair fell backward. This is a mistake. This symposium has standards, has requirements, he looked directly at Victoria, his voice dropping to something cold and personal. She's going to fail. And when she does, everyone will know exactly what happens when we let untrained children play in the adult world. He walked out, leaving his overturned chair behind. Marcus found Victoria in the hallway afterward, pulled her into a tight hug. Baby girl, you did so good. But Victoria was shaking. Because she'd seen the look in White's eyes, and she understood. The finals weren't going to be a test. They were going to be an execution. The announcement came via email at 8:47 p.m., finals to be live-streamed internationally. Estimated viewership, 200,000 plus. Victoria stared at her phone screen in the dim kitchen of their Section 8 apartment, where water damage stained the ceiling and the refrigerator hummed with a mechanical death rattle. 200,000 people. 200,000 witnesses to either her triumph or her public destruction. Marcus was working a double shift. The building manager had called in sick, so he was covering both the Hopkins Mathematics building and the medical campus. Victoria sat alone at their scratched formica table, her notebook spread around her like protective walls, trying to formalize her perspective geometry framework into something rigorous enough to present tomorrow. The knock came at 9:23 p.m. Victoria froze. Nobody visited their apartment. Nobody even knew where they lived. She opened the door to find Dr. Yuki Tanaka standing in the hallway, looking entirely out of place in her elegant gray suit amid the peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights. "Ms. Brown. May I come in?" Victoria stepped aside, suddenly hyper-aware of the second-hand furniture, the stack of unpaid bills on the counter, the mathematical proof she'd been scribbling on the back of junk mail because she'd run out of notebook paper. Tanaka sat at the kitchen table without being invited, her eyes scanning Victoria's work. "You're refining the dimensional constraints," she observed. "Good. You'll need that tomorrow. How did you find me?" "Your father's employment records." Tanaka looked up, her expression serious. "I came to warn you. Jason White is planning something. He's the one who's going to present the final challenge tomorrow, and he's going to make sure it's designed specifically to humiliate you." Victoria had already guessed this, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a punch. "Why are you telling me this?" Tanaka smiled sadly. "Because 28 years ago, Jason White was my friend. We were going to change mathematics together. Then we had one disagreement, one theoretical difference, and he couldn't tolerate it. He needed to be right more than he needed to be curious. And that need has poisoned him." She stood, walking to the window that overlooked the parking lot. "I've watched him dismiss brilliant thinkers for decades, anyone who approaches problems differently, anyone who threatens his orthodoxy. He's become the gatekeeper he used to hate. But you think I can solve it? I think you already have, in your mind. The question is whether you can articulate it under pressure, in front of people who want you to fail." Tanaka turned back. "Ms. Brown, Victoria, you have a gift. Not just intelligence, but perspective. You see connections others miss because you've never been taught what's impossible. But tomorrow, Jason is going to use every psychological weapon he has to make you doubt yourself." Victoria thought about the video of her registration, the comments calling her delusional, arrogant, a joke. She thought about every time she'd hidden her intelligence at school, made herself smaller, pretended not to know the answer. "My dad says I should withdraw," she said quietly. "He says nobody will blame me for walking away." "Your dad loves you. He wants to protect you." Tanaka gathered her purse. "But I suspect you didn't teach yourself graduate mathematics in empty lecture halls because you wanted to be protected." After Tanaka left, Victoria sat with her notebooks until Marcus came home at 2 a.m., exhausted and smelling like industrial cleaner. He found her still at the table, surrounded by pages covered in equations. "You should be sleeping, baby girl." "Can't sleep." Marcus pulled out a chair, sat heavily. "You know you don't have to do this, right? We can leave right now. Get in the car, drive somewhere, forget this whole thing. You think I should quit?" "I think," Marcus rubbed his face. "I think you're 12 years old, and you shouldn't have to carry this weight. These people, they're not going to be fair to you. They're not going to give you a chance. And when it's over, whether you solve their problem or not, we still gotta go home to this apartment, and I still gotta clean their floors, and life goes on. But what if I can solve it? What if I can show them that someone like me, from a place like this, can understand things they can't?" Marcus looked at his daughter, this brilliant, fragile, fierce thing he'd somehow raised, and saw his late wife in every determined line of her face. "Then I guess you better solve it," he said finally. "And I'll be right there in that audience, watching you prove every single one of them wrong." Victoria stayed up until dawn, refining her proof. Not because she doubted it, but because she needed it to be perfect. Tomorrow, in front of 200,000 people, she would either change everything or confirm every dismissive thing Professor Jason White believed about children like her. There was no middle ground left. Cambridge Hall had been transformed into something between a courtroom and a theater. Tiered seating rose on three sides, packed with mathematicians, journalists, and curious academics who'd heard about the child prodigy who claimed she could solve the unsolvable. 3 camera crews had set up positions to capture every angle. A massive screen displayed the live viewer count, 187,432 and climbing. Victoria stood at the center of it all, facing a chalkboard that stretched 20 feet across, her worn notebook clutched in hands that wouldn't stop trembling. She wore the same Goodwill blazer from registration, her cornrow braids pulled back in a style Marcus had spent an hour that morning perfecting with YouTube tutorials. Professor Jason White stood at a podium to her right, microphone clipped to his immaculate suit. He looked like a man about to enjoy something. "Ladies and gentlemen," White's voice carried through the hall, "we've had an interesting symposium. We've seen various approaches, various levels of competence. But now we arrive at the moment of truth." He turned to look directly at Victoria. "Ms. Brown has claimed, repeatedly, publicly, virally, that she can solve the White-Tanaka conjecture. A problem that has occupied some of the finest mathematical minds for 28 years. A problem that, frankly, has no solution." Scattered laughter from the audience. Victoria saw Marcus in the third row, his hands clasped so tight his knuckles were white. "So let's test that claim," White continued. "Your challenge, Ms. Brown, is simple: solve the White-Tanaka conjecture. You have 2 hours. Use any methods you like. Show your work. And prove to all of us that you're not simply a child who got lucky on a few tests." The viewer count hit 203,891. Victoria walked to the chalkboard, picked up a piece of white chalk, and began. She started with the basics, establishing the 2 competing frameworks, writing out White's constraints and Tanaka's contradictory proof. Her chalk clicked steadily, filling the board with notation that most of the audience couldn't follow but recognized as rigorous. 15 minutes in, she introduced her perspective geometry framework. The audience stirred. On camera, you could see people leaning forward. "The error," Victoria said, her voice amplified by the microphone, "is assuming that dimensional constraints are absolute. But dimensions aren't properties of mathematical objects, they're properties of the observer's framework." She drew a diagram, a hypercube projected onto different planes, each projection looking impossibly different. Professor White is observing from a 4-dimensional Euclidean space. His constraints are correct, within that space. Dr. Tanaka is observing from a 5-dimensional Riemannian manifold. Her constraints are also correct, within that space. She turned back to the board, writing faster now. "The conjecture fails because it assumes a single universal framework. But what if we construct a meta-framework, a way of describing mathematical structures that exists independent of dimensional perspective?" 30 minutes. 45. The proof grew, cascading across the board in 3 colors of chalk. Victoria could feel it coming together, each piece clicking into place like a lock tumbling open. Then she hit the gap. She was proving that certain structures could exist in both 4 and 5 dimensions when viewed through her perspective geometry, when she needed to demonstrate that the transformation between perspectives preserved the structure's essential properties. She wrote out the transformation, checked it, and felt her stomach drop. There was a gap. A critical gap. The transformation worked for most cases, but there was an edge condition, a specific scenario where the math just stopped. Where her framework predicted something impossible. The chalk fell from her hand, clattering against the board's tray. The audience murmured. The camera zoomed in on her face. The viewer count hit 234,672. Professor White smiled. Victoria stared at the gap in her proof, feeling everything collapse. He'd been right. She was just a child playing with concepts she didn't understand. She'd wasted everyone's time, humiliated her father, confirmed every cruel thing they'd said about her. Then she saw it. The gap wasn't a flaw. The gap was the answer. Her hand shot out, grabbing the chalk so hard it cracked in her grip. She started writing again, faster, her breath coming quick and sharp. "The gap exists," she said, her voice rising, "because I was still trying to preserve four-dimensional thinking. But the edge condition, the impossible case, only appears impossible if you assume dimensional spaces are separate. What if they're not separate? What if five-dimensional space doesn't exist above four-dimensional space, but contains it?" She drew a new diagram, hands shaking with adrenaline. Like how three-dimensional space contains all possible two-dimensional planes. You can't transform between them because there's no transformation needed. The four-dimensional structures Professor White describes are embedded in the five-dimensional space Dr. Tanaka describes. The proof transformed. What had been a gap became a gateway. Victoria introduced a fifth-dimensional constraint, not a mathematical dimension, but a perspective dimension. A way of describing which slice of five-dimensional reality you were observing. "Both proofs are correct," Victoria said, stepping back from the board, her blazer now covered in chalk dust. "Both have always been correct. You were both looking at a five-dimensional truth. But Professor White was only seeing the four-dimensional shadow it cast. Dr. Tanaka was seeing the full structure but couldn't prove it existed in four dimensions because she was trying to project it downward. Instead of recognizing that the four-dimensional version was already there, embedded, a cross-section of the larger reality. The hall was absolutely silent. Victoria wrote out the final statement: "The White-Tanaka conjecture is resolved through dimensional embedding. Structures meeting White's constraints exist in R as embedded submanifolds of structures meeting Tanaka's constraints in R. Both theories are aspects of a single unified framework." She set down her chalk and turned to face the audience. Professor White sat frozen at his podium, staring at the board. Dr. Tanaka had stood up in the front row, her hand over her mouth. Dr. Whitmore was frantically photographing the proof with his phone. The silence stretched for 5 seconds. 10. 15. Then Dr. Tanaka started clapping. Slow at first, then faster. Dr. Whitmore joined her. Then others. Then the entire hall erupted, not polite academic applause, but something wild and disbelieving. The viewer count hit 312,449. A mathematician in the fourth row stood, shouting to be heard over the applause, "It works. The transformation works. I can see 3 applications of this framework already." More people stood. Cameras flashed. Someone started live streaming their verification of Victoria's proof, showing each step checking out. Only Professor Jason White remained seated, staring at the board that held his life's work, solved, expanded, and revolutionized by a 12-year-old girl in a second-hand blazer. Marcus pushed through the crowd, pulled Victoria into a hug so tight she couldn't breathe. "Baby girl," he whispered. "Baby girl, you did it." Dr. Tanaka reached them next, tears streaming down her face. 28 years, she said. 28 years, Jason and I spent fighting, and it took a child to show us we were both right. She looked at Victoria. "You didn't just solve a mathematical problem. You showed us how to see differently." The symposium director was trying to restore order, announcing that independent verification would take weeks, but that the preliminary assessment was that Victoria's framework was sound. The audience wasn't listening, they were too busy discussing, arguing, celebrating. Only Jason White sat alone at his podium, watching his careful gatekeeping collapse around him. Watching a girl from Thornwood dismantle the walls he'd spent decades building. Watching the future arrive, whether he was ready for it or not. Victoria looked at the chalkboard covered in her handwriting, her framework, her proof, her perspective, and understood that she'd done something more important than solving an impossible problem. She'd proven that brilliance didn't require permission. That truth could be found by anyone willing to look from a different angle. That sometimes, the people everyone overlooks are the only ones who can see what everyone else missed. The viewer count hit 401,203, and the girl from the empty lecture halls became the mathematician who bridged two worlds.